gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this evening. I'd like to welcome our distinguished guests, Your Excellencies, and all of our friends and who are great supporters of our two authors. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone here this evening. I'm Katalin, Lynn, Editor-in-Chief of Helena History Press, the publishing house that my husband and I founded in 2013. We established the press to promote scholarship from or about Central and East Europe in English, and in a modest way to fill the void that currently exists about the region in the Anglophone market. It is the lack of source material in English which motivated us to establish a publishing house in this day and age. A key mission of ours is to support the work of emerging and independent scholars, primarily those doing original research on topics related to World War II and the Cold War. You can see in the slideshow of our published books that we had up earlier that we have published works by scholars from Serbia, Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, as well as other nations as well. Our other mission is to identify and publish important works that have never been translated into English. I'd like to illustrate this by talking a bit about a series of upcoming books on 1944-1945 Hungary. First, we are publishing the diary of Miksa Fenyő, written while he was in hiding from the Gestapo from June 1944 to January of 1945. As most of you know, Fenyő was the co-founder of Hungary's most important literary journal of the first half of the 20th century, Nyugat. Translated by his son Mario Fenyő, himself a fine scholar, this book captures Fenyő's literary voice. This edition features a new insightful introduction by literary scholar Zsuzsa Varga. This book will be published in November of this year. Along with this book, as part of this upcoming series, I think I went backwards, is the World War II memoir of Vilmos Nagybacon Nagy. He was the Hungarian Minister of Defense during World War II and the first Hungarian named of the righteous among nations by Yad Vashem, Israel's official memorial to the victims of the Holocaust. The of the righteous designation honors Gentiles who selflessly aided Jews in need. And of course, it is amazing that the Hungarian Minister of Defense during World War II was the first Hungarian to be accorded this honor. This book is very important and gives us a first-person account of World War II, and we're delighted to be able to finally publish it in English. The third work in this series is a new work, an important compendium of research related to the events of July 1944, subtitled Deportation of the Jews of Budapest Foiled, or as is often known, the Koszorús Action. Géza Jeszenszky has kindly taken time out of his very busy schedule to serve as the editor of this volume that will shed new light on this controversial topic in Hungarian history. This series will provide not only primary source material, but also new scholarship and further insight into the period of 1944-1945. As it is not enough to print books, but one must be able to distribute and market them as well, it is our agreement with Central European University Press which makes worldwide distribution of all our books possible. I would like to recognize the important role that Christina Koch, the director of CEU Press, and her team play in our success. I appreciate being able to introduce our press and its mission to you this evening. The topic of tonight's program, the internal deportations of the Stalinist era within the Soviet satellites, is another aspect of history of this region that has been virtually ignored by Western sources. These two powerful books by Kinga Széchenyi and Jaap Scholten, whose publication we're celebrating tonight, go a long way toward rectifying this scholarly void. I would like now to introduce Géza Jeszenszky, highly respected historian, former foreign minister of Hungary, and distinguished diplomat, who has agreed to serve as the moderator of our program for this evening. I'm pleased to turn this program over to him.
Thank you very much, Kati. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, good friends. Yes, it is my most important hat, so to say, being a historian, and it was just a kind of historical occurrence or accident that I had to play some role in politics as well. Hungarian history, as all of you know, is full of tragedies, but unfortunately Hungarians themselves, ourselves, very often contributed to these tragedies. Notwithstanding that, the Second World War, and particularly 1944, and the succeeding years, perhaps these 10 years until Imre Nagy's first prime ministership, is the darkest period in Hungarian history. And the two books we are presenting is about taking place in that period. We thought that we will present a quotation from Sir Brian Cartledge, the author of a wonderful, concise 600-page long history of Hungary. And I thought that I would base my introduction to a quotation from him about the Hungarian aristocracy. Although, as I will try to emphasize, these two books are, of course, mainly about the Hungarian aristocrats in Hungary and Transylvania, which, as you know, for 1,000 years was part of Hungary. But you can all read this quotation, and I think this is a very pertinent kind of summary of the role and how I think we, not only historians, but the general public, should read, should understand the role of the aristocracy in Hungarian history. I would emphasize that, and I am very happy to quote a distinguished foreigner, Sir Brian Cartledge, one-time ambassador of the United Kingdom in Hungary, and a professional historian as well, because my generation, when I grew up, were taught a very different outlook, a different characterization about the Hungarian aristocracy. Of course, that it was the exploitation class, also a class of degenerate people, and even the mildest description of them was what the proverbial Hungarian joke said about the two aristocrats, Aristide and Tassilo, who were not the most brilliant. But of course, this was a joke. Of course, there are people in all walks of life, from all classes of society, who are not very intelligent. But we have to give justice to the role of the Hungarian aristocracy, that how much not only they contributed to the leadership of this country, to the arts, and how devoted servants they were, most of them, they were of their nation. Of course, we know that, like, again, all classes, they were also not united. Perhaps even well-read Hungarians tend to think that all the Hungarian aristocrats were, so to say, Labans, supporters of the Habsburgs, Habsburg try, but it is again not true. There were generals among the Kurucs, Rákóczi's fighters as well, Esterházy Antal, for example. And of course, the 19th century great names, certainly Széchenyi István and Eötvös József are one of the giants in Hungarian history. Of course, the Transylvanian aristocracy was part of the Hungarian aristocracy, but a very distinctive, very different part of that, more Protestant than the majority of them probably. And well, they were both Transylvanian, not noblemen, Transylvanian patriots and Hungarian patriots. Well, we also know, of course, that they were easy targets of the communist, after the communist takeover, and they were expropriated, and not only expropriated, but many of them were imprisoned or forced into exile, and they were the more lucky ones who escaped in time in 45 or before 48, but it was still possible, because those who stayed behind, many of them out of patriotism, either in Hungary or in Transylvania, had to suffer a terrible fate, and this fate is described in both books we are dealing with today. But before I introduce the authors of the two books, I have to say, just for the sake of balance, that of course it was not the aristocracy alone which was a victim and also a hero because of their standing, because of their stature, because of their bravery, but also not only the high bourgeoisie, not even the middle class were very often victims of unfair trials or even without trial, imprisoned, but even the peasantry, the richer peasants, the so-called, using this Russian term, the kulaks. So Hungarian society, all sections of Hungarian society suffered, especially during the Rákosi period. But while we know all these trials, or at least something about the trials, also that very often communists themselves were victims of the purges. But a very special ill fate fell upon those whose suffering is not much known even in Hungary. After the changes, the truth came out, and of course many of us knew the truth before the changes, but this event, which we call in Hungarian kitelepítés, which usually is translated into English as deportation, was a kind of phenomenon which is extremely difficult for any Western citizen to understand, because they can understand that somebody can be a political prisoner, that they understand that there were unfair trials, purges, but that people who had no other fault than being born into a family, not necessarily a noble family, just because they had a nice flat, for example, it was enough to be coveted by a communist bigwig and to be served an order that in 24 hours you must leave that place and you should be relocated to a distant, unknown place. Well, it is not my task to tell this terrible story, but where we have two books which are both worth reading, although very hard reading, I must say. And I would like to say then a few words first about the author of the first one, the big one. Perhaps we can show it just to show, just for the. Yes, yes.
My copy.
Your copy. I will not take it away. Yes, so it is available, and I encourage you not only to buy it and perhaps to ask the author to sign it, but also to read it at least in installments. It is very heavy reading. So, Mrs. Kinga Széchenyi bears, as you understand, the names of one of the most distinguished Hungarian families, and perhaps it was the reason for the trials you went through, because being a young girl of 10 is certainly not a reason to be deported, to be punished for uncommitted crimes. And well, from the book you can learn about what she went through, and of course what not only her class went through, but as I said and emphasized, so large number of Hungarians went through. And it took a very long time to overcome, perhaps it is never possible to overcome the effects of these years, whether you were 10 at the age when it happened, or whether you were 70, because of course this kind of fate befell also upon very old people, so age didn't matter at all. But what again is not known, and is not much told even in the book, that when these people were allowed to leave that the country, not home, I wouldn't call it home, but this hut where they were assigned to live in, they were still not permitted to return to Budapest, even if they had people who would have been happy to welcome them back. So they had to find a place to live outside the capital, and of course, they were not permitted to go to have higher education or even to have secondary education. And even after 56, it took several years for them to be able to study and to make a career. And I think your life is a good example of that, but also a good example that people with a good background, with a good character, with a good upbringing, survive, if they are lucky, at least if their health permits, survive these trials, and they can build a successful career like you did as a teacher. I'm happy to learn that you taught at the school where I was a student at all this school, well, you became a distinguished author and sculptor and artist. So finally, those people who treated you so unfairly, should see. They didn't see, but justice has been served. So please say a few words about yourself and the book.
Thank you. My book, Stigmatized, deals with the darkest period of communist dictatorship that started a short while after the Second World War. At that time, the Soviet army occupied Hungary, and they left Hungary only after the changes in 1991, so it's a very long time under the Soviet occupation. Although for a short period there was a coalition government in Hungary, the communists were installed into power with the help of the Soviet Soviet section of the Allied Control Commission and the Soviet leaders. The area is named after Mátyás Rákosi, the most ardent disciple of Stalin. The system was considered a proletarian dictatorship. Its form of government was people's democracy. Both expressions are really absurd. Instead, we can speak about Rákosi's and his group's dictatorship. Rákosi and his people were indoctrinated and trained in the Soviet Union. And of course, they had lots of communist friends here in the country who served them. Rákosi and his group were, their system was far from democracy, was really a totalitarian regime, and as such governed by ideology and terror. The communists introduced one-party system and abused their power. Limited public rights in Hungary, no independent ideas were accepted. The regime was anti-religion, they were against private property, and nationalization took place in several stages. In a dictatorship, some groups of society become scapegoats. This is especially true when it turns out that the regime does not really work. And at that time, they blamed the scapegoats. Who were these people? Who were considered scapegoats? They were the so-called enemies of the people, or class enemies. People who, after the first stages of nationalization, still had some property, or were wealthy before 1945, or held high-ranking civil or military positions in an earlier era, the aristocracy, landowners, wealthier peasants, the so-called kulaks, or people whose ideas differed from communist ideology. As early as 1946, József Révai, who was the chief ideologist of the dictatorship, said that the enemies of the people, this is quotation, are guilty and punishable. The Rákosi regime was characterized by house searches, arrests, imprisonment, severe sentences, death sentences, purges, show trials, confiscation of property. Farmers suffered from the very high obligatory quota. People were deported or taken to camps. And all these filled the whole society with fear and terror. In 1982, from Ivan Berend, estimated that about 1/4 of the population was affected in one way or another between 1948 and 1956. This is more than 2 million people, something between 2 million and 2.5 million people. Now, my work, Stigmatized, focuses on the internal deportation that happened to a lot of class enemies. In my work, I point out several paragraphs of the 1949 Constitution of the Hungarian People's Republic and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that prove these deportations were unlawful, and it also shows what laws the communist leaders used to deport people who, as there was no real reason, could not have been punished. No court order was given at that time, nothing. I started my research a few years after the 50th anniversary of the internal deportations, because more than 10 years after the political changes in 1990, except for the Hortobágy deportations, little was done in this field. It seemed very important to break the silence and uncover the facts of the communist period. For the kids, it was even dangerous to speak about the deportations or other ordeals. There is another reason why I started to research and write about the deportations, because I and my family were also deported from Budapest on the very first day of the deportations, May 21st, 1951. And when coming here by taxi, I crossed the street where from we were deported. It's about 50 meters from this location. Deportation was one of the preventive actions employed by the dictatorship. They wanted to ruin, possibly liquidate the class enemies, try to re-educate the people. Well, they weren't successful in that. To solve the housing problem caused by the war, to accelerate Sovietization in Hungary. Well, this was prescribed by Stalin, not only here, but in the other satellite countries. Supply labor for the new state farms and remove all people considered dangerous for the system. These groups there were really three groups of deportees. The estimated number of deported people to 12 labor camps in Hortobágy is about 10,000. We do not have the exact numbers because only the list only of one camp exists, but Hortobágy deportees are collecting the names. Now, except the second group, the deportees from Budapest, the number is about 14,000. We have lists, but they are not complete, and they have to be completed. Some people are looking after names and families. The third group, only in documents, they say there were about 1,010 200 people. They were deported from smaller towns and villages. The number must be much, much higher, but research hasn't been done in this field. And besides these, there were also sporadic deportations from, let's say, from 46, and they lasted until the late 50s. There are some traces of even later deportations. We have to mention here that these were mass deportations, meant that whole families with infants and the elderly were deported. The oldest person I found in the Budapest list was 94 at the time of the deportation. The deportation orders did not indicate how long the persons would be expelled. Only the Budapest deportees had the right to appeal, but the appeals were not really very successful. At the time of the deportation, their properties and belongings were all confiscated and never returned. Now, these people, when taken to the place of deportation, were not allowed to leave the assigned obligatory dwelling place. They needed police, even some to go to some other places. They had to get some papers from the Interior Ministry. The deportation to Hortobágy, well, as you know, it's an underpopulated region with grass-covered pastures and patches of arable land. Started at the end of the 1940s with the greatest wave in June 1950 and continued until March 1953. About 2 or 3 weeks after Stalin's death, from a nearby village, they took about 30 people to Hortobágy. Sorry. Most people taken to Hortobágy were kulaks, wealthier farmers. During the night, police raided these people and gave only about an hour to pack some of their belongings, carried them off in cattle cars for a 2-day journey to Hortobágy. On arrival, their documents and most of their meager belongings were confiscated. They spent years in in horrible conditions, in overcrowded sheepfolds, stables, hen coops, on state farms, where they had barely not enough food. It was also very difficult to buy food if they had money. Most labor camps were fenced in or their border was marked. The deportees were under constant supervision, police supervision. They had a special kind of police in Hortobágy. These held daily roll calls, raids at night, and supervised dive work. Not only men, but women and also children were victims of corporal punishment. They were forced to do any kind of work in agriculture, fish farming, and so on, from daybreak to nightfall for the lowest possible wages. Strictly speaking, they were forced laborers. Richard Carlton in 1955 called them slave laborers. Children had to work from the age 12, even their elementary schooling was not solved. Now the second group, the deportees from Budapest, their deportation, as I mentioned, started in May 1951 and lasted until July 18th. But afterward, the police kept searching for people, for families who had fled. Most of them ended up in prison. Not too exact list of Budapest deportees can be found in the state historical archives, and lots of other documents that show that the deportation took deportees to 137 villages and lots of farms around the villages. The document also mentions, this is absurd, the fact that policemen and members of the state security forces received bonuses for taking part in the deportation. The Budapest deportees had less than a day before their eviction. The families were carried off in trains and trucks with armed policemen, with very few of their belongings. The locked carriages were heavily guarded. They got one room or a summer kitchen or a corner in a stable at Gulag houses. They were prohibited to leave the borders of the village. Police raided their places mostly late at night, sometimes with police dogs. I have such memories. Took some of the deportees for interrogation at night or during the day. Their letters were read and copied by the police, and they checked their parcels as well. At times, even violence occurred. They were deprived of their civil rights. Well, for instance, deportees had no right to elect anybody, but there were places where during elections they were not even allowed to go into the streets, so they had to keep in the houses or gardens. From time to time, the police spread the rumor that the deportees would be taken to Siberia. Their existence was hopelessly uncertain, as they had similar work as the Hortobágy deportees. Retired people lost their pensions. Children over 14 worked with the grown-up people, younger ones only in summertime. Children over 14 were instructed by older deportees, competent in different subjects. Young men were enlisted into labor service. Well, we can ask who helped the deportees. Most of them could not have survived hardships and poverty without the help of relatives and friends, and without the solidarity of a lot of village people. What really helped was their faith, traditions, and also their sense of humor. For the younger generation, the never complaining parents and grandparents' moral strength and dignity set example for their whole lives. The deportees tried to bring up the children under extreme circumstances and during persecution, showed the children how to become well-balanced personalities and how to persevere in different situations. And these features were very much needed in the next decades of very brutal discrimination. After Stalin's death in 1953, Rákosi's power it was somewhat reduced for a short while, and the July 1953 Clemency Act released the deportees, but only with certain restrictions. They were still banned from the capital, other cities, and the frontier area, and they were under police supervision. Some of them until the 1990 political changes. The deportees became now really homeless. no room was for them. And the only way to get some income was manual labor for a very long time. The class enemy stigma remained. They were discriminated when applying for jobs or wanted to study, first even in high school, later on only higher level. The X sign before the names of school children was a real stigma. And as a conclusion, I think the country lost a lot by not using qualified and knowledgeable people who could have worked for the progress of the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This story or this extract from the life of one of the victims is very telling, and I hope it will not, what you have just heard from Mrs. Kinga Széchenyi, will not discourage you, rather will encourage you to read the book, because I think the least we can do is to understand how much our fellow Hungarians suffered, and we could also have become victims. Actually, I also grew up at the same time, and we were not deported ourselves, but we knew that it can happen, and I grew up with the knowledge that as it happened to some friends or relatives, it may happen to us as well. Of course, this is a crime, there is no question, but not a crime without parallels. In Hungarian history, I think it is not unfair, and hopefully it will not be painful to, or not will be taken amiss if I say that it was only a few years earlier that a fate, not similar but even worse, befell upon almost 1 million Hungarians, Hungarian Jews, and this 1944, the very term deportation, is known for, that was their fate, with the difference that many of them could not return. They were really murdered in Auschwitz or other death camps. So we may say that these Hungarian victims of the 51 deportations, quite a few of them totally suffered but died. The aim was probably the same, like it happened in the Soviet Union, the infamous Gulag archipelago, that people should not be executed or killed immediately, but should be made to work as long as their strength lasts, and then they should perish. So in Hungarian history, certainly I think the Hungarian Holocaust was a forerunner, and it is also tragic to think that only a few years later, again, people became victims without any reason, and it was not a revenge, it just shows that dictatorship and these two terrible systems, Nazism and communism, how much they had in common. Another parallel, it was not only a Hungarian specialty, that what happened to the so-called upper class or middle class, upper middle class, but the same pattern occurred in all these communist-dominated countries, all countries in the Soviet bloc, and certainly it was even worse probably when the same fate the same treatment was given in Romania, where the aristocracy and the upper classes and middle classes also had this. But if you happen to be a Hungarian, and most of the victims there were Hungarians, especially in Transylvania, because in Transylvania the educated class, the more well-to-do class were composed of Hungarians. So the story, which is probably even in today's Hungary is hardly known, is the story told by Jaap Scholten, Comrade Baron. And this is another remarkable work because it is not by a victim himself or herself, but somebody who came from a quite faraway country, although the Netherlands is certainly not so far from Transylvania mentally, culturally, because, well, we do that, especially the Calvinists in the Netherlands did help and continue to help their fellow Protestants in Transylvania among the Hungarians. So it was anyhow, I don't know whether it was what kind of your personal background made you interested in Hungary or in Transylvania. Was it only the fact that you were lucky enough to marry a Hungarian Dutch lady? Because you, yes, okay, so we will, I expected it anyhow. And what is also very important that you didn't start to become a historian or an author, and you studied design, industrial design, and graphic art, but you, as a writer, you are able to describe very graphically and with great talent what happened. And whereas Kinga Széchenyi's work is also a scholarly work as well as a eyewitness account and account of people who went through all that. But your work, anyhow, you are a writer now, and I think it is, having read your book, I'm not surprised that with that book and with others you have won literary prizes in the Netherlands. And what is especially enjoyable in this very terrible story, that it is not simply an account of what happened. That would be worthwhile recording and should be known. But of course, you mix the past with the present, and of course, you rely heavily on your friends, acquaintances who tell their own story, but you make your own observations, and it brings to life not only what happened, but to the character of the people, who, again, the majority of the people you were able to talk were children or young people, but of course, they tell the story, and through you tell the story of not only their parents, but also their ancestors, because we also learn not only about the beautiful castles, homes, stately homes they had lived, but also how useful, how popular they were to the local people, to the peasants, if you like. So, in fact, it is again a refutation. Your work is a refutation that these people were exploiting the people. People who had been exploited would not remember so warmly these people, and I will say something more about it later on. But first, I ask you to say something more insight about the book you wrote.
I will say, I'm a very strict publisher. I'm a little bit afraid of her. And I was allowed only to show 5 pictures, although I have hundreds. And I was also restricted in time. So, and I have always a great difficulty in keeping up with that. So when I stand, I think it's better. And we'll look in hours. I'm very happy to be here. Géza, thank you for the introduction. And thank you. It's great to be here with this group, with Kinga Széchenyi and with Palffy and with Gergely, or Chowdhury, who will come up to the stage a little later. All 3 of you, I interviewed for my book, although the 2 of you, I think, through internet. I always sent you emails with questions, both of you, and you were both very generous in answering, and you're both, yeah, we drank a little bit.
That's late.
And I am extremely happy with such a publisher who puts so much energy behind our books, the book of Kinga and me, what I think is really exceptional. My book is now translated in a few countries, languages, but I have only one publisher like you who really organizes something. Mostly it's alone. And I think it is great to be in this great house, what is so appropriate for both of the books, because, well, really, it is now a museum of literature. picture, but it used to be a house of Kádár. What I will do, I will tell a little bit, and then I will read three little parts of the book. I was in Bucharest, not this winter, but last winter, and there is, in the Strada Jean-Louis Calderon, number 66, there is a tiny museum, but a really great museum. It's the Memorial Victims of Communism. And when my book was presented in Bucharest, I went there, and on the wall is this sentence somewhere, and I wrote it down. The greatest victory of communism, a victory dramatically revealed only after 1989, was to create people without a memory, a brainwashed new man unable to remember what he was, what he had, or what he did before communism. And I think that is an essential idea, and I agree with it. And what the museum tried was doing justice through memory, and I think that is what the book of Kinga and my book is doing, and I think it's for that important. A couple of months ago, David Price Jones wrote a review in the New Criterion about Comrade, and the title of it was Elegy for Elegance, and I like that title. An elegy is a funeral song, and I looked up this morning synonyms for elegance, and the list of words that was given by Google is quite good. This is charm, so synonyms for elegance: charm, culture, grace, gentility, noblesse, politeness, purity, restraint, style, taste. And to me, there are values that come quite close to the essence of humanity. And I think what a dictatorship tries to do is to kill these values. And I think in the world that we live today, it has and I think it is a strange thing that happened to your book and to my book, because the book of Kinga appeared in 2008 in Hungary and Hungary, and my book appeared in the winter of 2010 in the Netherlands. But I think both books gained in relevance, because I think we live in a world where these values, charm, culture, grace, gentility, noblesse, politeness, purity, restraint, style, and taste, are again haunted, isolated, stigmatized, imprisoned, deported, tortured, and killed. And I think you see it everywhere happening in Turkey and Russia and in many countries. And well, for that reason, I think the books gain what did I say now? Relevance. And I think that was also why the aristocracy had immediately, they were like enemies of the people and enemies of the state, number one, because they stand very much for these qualities and for these values. And again, you see now in the world, all kinds of aristocracies are haunted. And again, I don't, not only aristocracy by birth, but aristocracy by education or talent or mind or soul. And I think it's a sad thing. And you see also that what Kinga describes and what Kinga for Hungary mostly, and I for Transylvania mostly, is that how a state is doing that, using the same salami tactics that were used here in Hungary and in Romania. And the group of people that I focused on, the aristocracy, they were the second slice of salami that had to be taken out. The first slice of salami in Romania that had to be taken out was all the officers of the former Royal Army. So the first big action, coordinated action of the Securitate was to deport in one night all the important officers. And the second action was, and that was different from was announced a few days before that you were had to be deported, but in Romania it was completely by surprise. It was actually very well done by the Securitate, because only a few people escaped this nightly deportations. It happened between 1 and 3 o'clock in the early morning of March 3rd, 1949. And on that I concentrated. Okay, now I will read 3 fragments of the book. The first one is a little bit longer, the second one is intermezzo, and the third one is a philosophical one. These are actually the words of Palffy, the last one. Okay. This is the book. I'm a complete outsider for this whole story. So I tried to research and to find what I could find about it. And one of the places where I went was to Siget in Romania, where there is a big prison. And that prison was mostly used for political prisoners. And it was one of these really awful places. What I noticed immediately, I tried if I could sleep over in the prison, because they sometimes do, because I wanted to feel the prison. But when I suggested it at the lady at the reception, if I could stay for the night there, she said, no, only groups are allowed for the night. And it was quite crazy, because the deportations were always groups, so they always took a group of society. So I was not allowed to stay there. This is what I write about there. I have to take off my glasses. In a long corridor on the ground floor, photographs of people who died under communism have been stuck to the wall and labeled with their names. Oh no, it's the one before. Can you go back to the pictures? No. There's one with a lot of pictures. Can you?
Sure.
Yeah, it's not sharp. It can be because I took off my glasses. There are thousands of them, and they all look directly at you. In silence, I stare at the black and white photos. Many of the men have powerful faces, handsome fellows. There are fewer women, but they are no different. Characterful, strong faces. I look for a Hungarian name, ideally a Hungarian aristocrat, but I failed to find one. I'm slightly disappointed, but then I realize that compared to the total number of victims of communism in Romania, the contingent of Hungarian nobles is minuscule. Now that I'm walking past a wall in Siget that shows the extent of the destruction of people and talent by the communists, I start to have doubts. In Romania, it's the estimation is it's like 200,000 people died during these Stalinist years. Isn't the project I'm working on idiotic? Why devote my time to a handful of aristocrats? They had a prominent and privileged position for centuries. Under communism, they were treated away as ordinary people for once, tyrannized just as terrible. Isn't it a bit embarrassing to talk about their destroyed property and their lost world in light of the hundreds of thousands of victims? I find myself in a room with a map of Romania on the wall. There's a picture of the map. Yeah, that one. Thank you. At the top it says in bold lettering, you can read it.
So it's somewhat
Romania, the concentration camp system. The legend explains that each little square represents a prison. There are 44 of them. A circle stands for a labor camp, 72 in total. A triangle represents a location where deputies were sent, 63 in all. An oval indicates a place of interrogation, 61 of those. The crosses, 93 of them, are places of execution and mass graves. Then there are 10 psychiatric institutions of a political nature and more than 100 local and regional security headquarters were accused and the sentences that resulted. Here, the hundreds of thousands crushed by the Romanian aviation industry are reduced to their names. I note down a few. Stefan Bozori, 5 years for singing the song, and my Romanian is very bad, Kreshka Veged, Long Live the King. Ludovic Vulop, 25 years for religious beliefs. He was a Jehovah's Witness. Yuri Savaris, 8 years for swearing at the Soviet army. Dimitri Bacon, 6 years for taking Mark's portrait down the wall and dancing on it while singing an old song. Well, compared to the 6 years for it's not that bad. The 3 most common criminal acts punished by many years in prison or labor camp, either of which meant descent into hell. The second part of my book is about that. Were membership of a subversive organization, being a counter-revolutionary, and having the wrong social background. I walked on into a pitch-dark cell, number 2. This was a punishment cell, insulated and painted black. No light entered. You were locked up in utter darkness. I pulled the door shut behind me, as far as it will go, and sit on the floor. A strip of light still shines in past the door. Sentenced to 5 years in prison for singing a song. The severity of the sentences is dizzying. The communist regime's combination of arbitrariness, insanity, and sadism makes me feel sick. In an article entitled Teaching About Elites in the Era of Equality, historian Alice Archer Wason quotes Francis Bacon, who wrote 300 years ago that the monarchy without an aristocracy renders up a tyranny just as brutal and absolute as that of the Turks several centuries earlier. Okay, going back. The aristocracy has a moderating effect on the holder of power, standing between ruler and people as early as 12,022. The Golden Bull gave the Hungarian nobles the right to depose the king for misrule. The removal of that buffer had far-reaching consequences. The destruction of a cultivated elite and an increase in brutal terror went hand in hand. Archer Wason writes that the horrors of the 20th century have made us aware that flogging and whipping are trivial compared to sending people to gas chambers or the Gulag. He suggests we have paid too little attention to the importance of honor and culture in moderating the cruelty of the powerful. Romanian publisher and philosopher Gergely said of communism, it creates a society founded on terror that hides behind the mask of a debate about a better society. If you can find the picture with Ceausescu and a lot of bears. That bear. This is not a good one. Yeah. I got this picture from the hunting master who was hunting that day with Ceausescu. He shot 60 bears within 2 hours. And Ceausescu is in the middle with the little chapkan, and next to him in the checkered coat is Helena, Ceausescu, with a plastic bag in her hand.
Shopping bag.
Shopping bag, yeah. She was not too much interested into the whole shooting affair. And they arrived with a couple of alouettes from Bucharest, and Ceausescu normally took the whole top of the Communist Party with him from Bucharest. It was a good method to be sure that nobody could have a coup while you were in the nature. And it was a nice example because he was the only one with a rifle, and all the others had to watch how he was killing spree. And this really fanatic shooting of bears was mostly in the 80s, because before he tried switched to the Bears, and he was really the leader in the Bears. And the Romanian people were at that moment starving, because it was the years of that everything was on ration. And so the Romanians had a really hard time, and Jessenszky was hunting. It was a huge operation to organize the hunts. But at the same time, I think this shows the good sense of humor of the Romanians. Jessenszky had a monopoly on the hunting of large bears, whose diet was supplemented while the people of Romania were close to starvation, surviving on good stories and a sense of humor. One story, during the rounds, was that on a particular bear hunt, no bears came close. None approached the carcass laid at the feeding place, and none at all were spotted in the forest. The master of the hunt had a serious problem. Jessenszky had already been flown in from Bucharest in Alouette to shoot a bear. This might cost the hunt master his head quite literally. In a nearby village, a traveling circus had a brown bear that could juggle. The hunt master, assisted by Jessenszky's Jeszenszky, securitate officers, dragged the bear out of the circus while the dictator was taking a nap in his lines, and used long sticks to prod the tame animal towards the place where that horse was waiting for it. But before Jessenszky could take aim and fire, the bear jumped onto one of the gamekeeper's bicycles and cycled for its life away into the forest. Some people ask me if this is really happened, but I think it was a way to keep the good spirit up. Okay, we'll finish with a short piece that I have not written myself, but Palffy, who I interviewed, and I think this sums up very good, better than I could, what part of the consequences are of 45 years of dictatorship. Palffy wrote to me, the worst thing about 50 years of communism isn't the sweeping away of the aristocracy. The worst thing is the wiping out of the old civil society, of all the people and classes with a long tradition of honest work, service, independence of mind, merchants, farmers, entrepreneurs, academics, professionals. In their place, we have generations filled with cynicism and an attitude of what the hell, we're just doing what we can to survive. Most are detached from any consciousness of history and tradition, and they tend towards idiotic forms of political extremism. You know nothing about the underlying concept of a civil society familiar to happier Western countries. That is the great tragedy here. And the great, this is the way it works. I think the great tragedy, the destruction of honor, culture, and trust, because I think the destruction of trust has really far-reaching consequences. In the absence of trust, the cancer of corruption takes root and spreads, and we're all witnessing that right now.
Thank you very much both for your present words and also really mainly for having written this book. You deserve to be an honorary Hungarian, and perhaps your children are Hungarian or partly. Well, we thought with Kati that in addition to the authors, we would ask two people to somehow stand as witnesses or just as readers, but interested readers to say comments or to say what their feeling is about the two subjects. Well, István, Palffy, or everybody calls him Pista, was a little bit older than myself. He was just turning 15 when communism came, and just finished high school when these terrible stories happened. He comes, as many of you know, from, again, a very distinguished Hungarian family who gave many great statesmen and other leaders. His grandfather was a minister of cults and cults and education, and he was the leader of the Hungarian delegation at the Paris Peace Conference, and later on represented Hungary in Geneva at the League of Nations. But Pista has much to say for his own merit, and he will say a few words how he survived these times, why he was not deported, and why, and of course, that led also gave enough reason for him to escape in '56, to build a career, to raise a family in Britain, the United Kingdom, but to return after the changes and to become an amateur historian, writing a wonderful history of the Palffy family, and also available on the internet, unique history of Hungary, a kind of so-called rollback history, which I recommend every beginner to learn, who wants to learn about the history, to read. Now I ask you, Pista, to tell really why you were not deported, but where you spent these terrible days.
Is this on?
Yes, please sit.
No, I hate. May I stand? Sorry, I can't talk sitting, but I have basically one quick comment that after '68, when Rákosi introduced socialist people's democracy, Budapest had not lost its sense of humor. There was a question going the rounds: in what way is a people's democracy different from a plain democracy? The answer was much like a straitjacket from a plain jacket. So that was the spirit which was around. Otherwise, I'm here on false pretenses. I was not deported. By mysterious misspelling of my name, when they brought me my kitelepítési határozat, whatever it's called, they misspelled, instead of István Palffy, they had Imre Palffy. And the honest caretaker in the house, whom they of course had to wake up in the middle of the night, said, "Sorry, there is no one of that name registered in this house," which was true. He could have added, "There is an István," he didn't. They put me on the bottom of the pile, and they never caught up with me. However, a question to Kinga, if I may, on the page I've marked here. Sorry, may I turn the page? You say, and the confusing thing is that in English you use a masculine pronoun, namely people who were not deported when they should have been because they left their place of where they lived, address, but were caught up with later. And you say here, sorry, and I can't without spectacles see it, anyway, one person was caught up who had gone away on medical treatment to the country. They caught up with him and interned him and eventually took him to his place of deportation. Now, the original Hungarian has őt, which is, of course, genderless. And the story, I want to know whether it refers to my mother, because I think I told you about her at the time. She left Budapest in May or early June '51 for Havies, medical treatment, full medical cover. They did catch up with her very touchingly on the night between the 24th and 25th December. As a Christmas present for the family, I happened to be there to spend Christmas with her. She was then incommunicado for about 3 months, was then deported, forced labor, and eventually sent to her place of deportation. So I don't know whether Kinga refers to my mother or not there.
Well, there were several people with similar problems. And some people, well, there were some physicians
Okay, well, we'll talk about it. Yes.
Hospitals, and as I mentioned later on, the
Microphone,
police went after these people, and most of them ended up in prison. There were lots of other cases. We could speak about these for hours, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. It was interesting seeing it here. So I don't know what else I can add. Jaap's book, I really have to start reading. I got a copy of it in the original Dutch when it was launched in Amsterdam. So I had a dedicated copy of a book in a language which I never learned. I said, I have to read it. I have. I read it, but I may have missed many pretty nuances with which I will now catch up, Jaap, and heaven help you if I got it wrong. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And finally, I would like to ask one of the offspring of these people who were hit by these trials. And this is introducing Gergely or Gregory Roy Chowdhury. I have to tell a little bit of the background which came to unite the two of us. While I represented Hungary in Washington, D.C., we met many Hungarians living in the D.C. area, and one of the very memorable meetings was to meet Countess Hanna Mikes, and she was not simply coming from a very distinguished old Transylvanian family, coming from Zabola. She married Géza Teleki, the son of Prime Minister Pál Teleki, and her life story, which she told us, we also recorded it, is extremely exciting itself. In the year 2000, with my wife and some friends, we invited her on a trip to Transylvania. We drove to Transylvania, and we, among others, visited not only many relatives of her, but also the family place where she was born and grew up, the castle at Zabola. It was not yet returned to the family, but it was also a very sentimental reunion, among others, with an old servant of her. So again, it was showing how much local people respected and loved the masters, the family. But there is almost a happy ending to that story of what happened to the Mikes and so many Hungarian aristocrats in Transylvania, a kind of sequence to your story, that unlike in Hungary, for reasons, certain reasons, in Romania, about 10 years after the changes or even more, there was reprivatization, and with serious efforts and having a good lawyer, people or descendants of people who happened to have also a good lawyer could claim back the property which was confiscated, so to say nationalized, but it was really confiscation. And Hanna, our good friend, had a niece, Katalin Mikes, who lived in Austria. Well, she was a victim of these trials, but eventually was able to leave Romania and lived in Austria. And there she met a gentleman coming from Bengal in India. They got married, and they have 2 sons. And when Katalin Mikes, again with a good, as I said, a good lawyer, was successful in claiming back both the castle and some property, woods around it, they started to renovate it and to restore it. And well, there is this romance too, that both sons married Hungarian ladies from similar background. And with my wife, we were, well, very much honored to be invited to the wedding of yours with Kata Apor. And that was a really memorable wedding.
That's my brother.
Well, so I would say that after all these terrible things which we heard a little bit about today, there would be, we should be happy that, well, justice has been served finally, because at least some of these families are back in Transylvania, rebuilding their homes, and but unfortunately, the happy ending is not there, and this is why perhaps you can say something. What happened to, or what is happening to you and Zabola, and what you are fighting for?
Well, basically, I moved to Zabola in 2001, so quite a while ago, after my mother managed to get back some of the buildings and the properties in the forests. And we slowly started to rebuild, renovate, have more lawsuits. And finally, at the EU accession, we managed to get back larger properties back. But immediately after the EU accession, somehow restitution got to a stop because Romania entered the European Union and everything became obsolete. So we, for many years, worked on what we managed to get back. And at a certain point in 2013, the Romanian state started to attempt renationalization. And in a way, of course, it's very different today than at the time of the deportations. But what is happening now is that the state creates a list, like they used to create lists previously, and pick out certain individuals and certain families, basically maybe to start to take a slice out of society, like you said.
So you have a question? No? Okay, that's not a question. So, I think it is certainly worth visiting Transylvania, worth visiting the castles, homes which are still available, which are still there. Some of them are being rebuilt, restored, but many of them are in decay, and that is also available from your book. So I think what we heard this afternoon was enough for us to reflect also upon the past, upon some of the injustices which are little known, and also that justice still has to be fought for, and we should all watch and hope that with calling attention to this story and to the present, well, finally, well, you cannot restore what was lost, what was destroyed, but at least we can preserve that memory, and also we can see the resilience of these people, whether in Hungary or in Transylvania, to restore their life and to rebuild their life and to pass on their experiences. I think we all owe a great deal of thanks and gratitude to the two authors and other people who write about these subjects. We also owe gratitude to the publisher, but also I see the translator of Kinga Széchenyi's work, Katica Avakomovic. So you are also, we thank you too, and thank you for coming. Did we decide to have questions?
Yeah, I think we have questions now.
Okay, well, there will be questions possible, but also later on when we have a kind of reception, we can answer. But if you have some questions, we are happy to take.
Oh, sorry. I did not realize, and maybe I hope I'm not the only one, I may be. Could you explain to me why Romania, on accession to the EU, the program has stopped, or what? I mean, what law or why? You're saying that you can no longer get land back, or I didn't quite understand that, but you said that your efforts have stopped.
In order to access the EU, the Romanian state created a law which said total restitution. Anything you owned until 1945, you could claim back.
Okay.
once they accessed the EU, the law exists, but was not applied, so you had to go to court. And most of the families didn't manage to get back those properties. We were one of the few who won a lawsuit and physically took over the properties. Many people won lawsuits but were not able from 2005-6 on to take physically over their properties.
Okay.
And
So
are
it's a
now
question of
faced,
timing,
now faced,
it's not
yes,
so
and are now
much the-
faced by the state claiming properties back.
Okay.
And we have, for example, currently 10 lawsuits against us. So.
I know. Okay.
And, it's a question to you. Is that, does it matter that your family is of Hungarian descent? Or is that not does it also happen to families in Wallachia, Moldavia?
Well, I was hoping to find cases like this, and I took around a journalist from the Financial Times last summer, but we did not find Romanian families. We visited the different heads of the church, so Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, and so on, and the churches have problems, but it is mainly in Transylvania where people face these problems.
So it really shows that membership in the European Union and earlier in the Council of Europe was expected to induce a country to perform, to behave more properly. But it is the contrary. What we see that once they were admitted, they no longer feel any kind of urge or any kind of requirement to comply with the very laws and very pledges which they underwrote and what was expected, what is expected from them. Any other question, please?
Just a minute. Second, the microphone is coming.
Sorry. No, it's the same case with Hungarian church properties, which were promised back and never returned. The same case with language rights, which were promised and still are not fully made. So it's the same case at all levels, I think. Hungarian, specifically Hungarian in that case. Thank you.
And I like to add, as an outsider, that to me, the Hungarian families in Transylvania, I think they are a great asset for the Romanian state, because I think for tourism, it could be such an incredible good thing to have these houses restored, like Zabola and like Miklósvár, and there are a few places now that you could travel around. It could be incredibly a boost for Transylvania. And to me, that is something that surprises me so much, that it is so short-term thinking to make life quite impossible for these families. Did you ever speak to anybody in Bucharest who had different views on it, who saw that as a possibility for Romania, as a chance?
I think the focus is simply somewhere else. When you are in Bucharest, I spend my time usually one day in Bucharest, one day in Zabola, and on the weekend in Budapest, and I meet the different people, decision makers, and I don't think they are particularly interested in giving back some buildings, and the focus is not there. So I've not met people who would have been open or interested in such.
But when the focus is not there, then it is not of enough importance to them. But why is it then of enough importance to try to renationalize?
Because land and forest and other items are part of those estates, and it's not so much about the buildings, it's mainly about the forests and the influence you have once you own large areas in the countryside.
Thank you. Other questions? Well, if not, then again, thank you for coming, and well, we have a chance, you have a chance to meet the authors, to ask them to sign the book if you have it or buy it, and to chat a little bit. And again, thank you for
we sell books there, eh?
Yes, we're selling books.
I want to be clear about that.
Well, yes, you are also.